Turn the lights down and get comfortable. Tonight's story begins in the dark. Before we start, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what kind of stories keep you up at night.
My name is Zane Jackson, and I've been a park ranger for long enough to know the difference between something that goes wrong and something that never should have happened in the first place. The call came in just after dawn, when the fog still clung to the pines like damp breath, and the forest hadn't decided whether it wanted to wake up yet. Dispatch said there'd been a possible aircraft down somewhere in the Blackroot Preserve, deep woods, no transponder signal, no mayday, no flight plan filed. Just a sudden absence where a blip should have been. That alone was enough to set my teeth on edge. Planes don't simply vanish. I rolled my truck past the last service road and into territory only rangers and search teams ever see. I'd walked these woods for over 20 years, memorized their sounds, their moods, the way the wind spoke through different trees depending on the season. That morning, the forest felt muted, like it was holding something back. No birds, no insects. Even the tires on the dirt road sounded too loud, crunching like I was breaking some unspoken rule by being there. I parked at mile marker 17, grabbed my pack, and started in on foot. According to the rough coordinates we'd pulled from a civilian weather radar anomaly, whatever went down hadn't followed a normal trajectory. It hadn't spiraled or burned. It had dropped straight through the air and stopped. As I hiked, the smell hit me first. Not smoke, not fuel, just a sharp, sterile scent, like hot metal after a lightning strike, mixed with something faintly electrical. I remember thinking it didn't belong out there. The woods have their own language of smells, and this wasn't one of their words. I found the impact site in a shallow clearing ringed by old-growth firs. No scorch marks, no debris field, no torn earth, just an object resting in the dirt as if it had been gently placed there. It was smooth, white, and elongated, about the size of a small bus, with rounded ends and no visible seams, no wings, no cockpit, no markings of any kind. It looked less like a crashed plane and more like something unfinished, something that never learned how to be part of the world it landed in. I circled it slowly, hand resting near my radio, though I didn't know who I'd call or what I'd say. The surface reflected the trees in a warped, subtle way, like the forest was being remembered incorrectly. I didn't hear engines cooling or metal popping. There was no heat. When I placed my palm against it, it was cool to the touch, almost cold, and I felt a faint vibration beneath my skin, steady and patient. That was when my radio crackled to life on its own. Not static, not a voice, just a low, rhythmic pulse matching the vibration under my hand. And somewhere deeper in the woods, something moved, slow and deliberate, as if it had been waiting for me to arrive.
I pulled my hand away from the object, and the vibration stopped instantly, like a switch had been flipped. My radio went dead with it, the screen blank, battery indicator gone, as if it had never existed. I stood there longer than I cared to admit, listening to my own breathing and the faint creak of trees swaying far above. Whatever had moved in the woods had gone still again, but the sense of being observed didn't fade. It settled in, heavy and deliberate. I forced myself to do what I'd been trained to do: assess, document, report. I took photos with my phone, though the screen flickered each time I aimed it at the craft. The images looked wrong when I checked them, edges slightly blurred, the object seeming shorter or longer depending on the angle, like it refused to be captured accurately. I marked the coordinates by hand in my notebook, then backed away and scanned the tree line. That's when I noticed the ground. No footprints, no skid marks, not even crushed pine needles beneath the thing. It hadn't landed, it had arrived. Protocol said I should have hiked back out immediately and requested air support. Protocol didn't account for standing alone in front of something that clearly didn't belong to any agency I'd ever worked with. I decided to push a wider perimeter, see if there were signs of survivors, debris, anything that would make this feel more familiar. As I moved through the brush, the forest remained unnaturally quiet. My boots made noise, my gear shifted, but nothing else answered. It was like sound itself was being swallowed. About 50 yards out, I found the first anomaly. A tree bent inward toward the clearing, its trunk warped smoothly, as if softened and reshaped rather than broken. The bark was intact, stretched thin, almost polished. I touched it and felt the same cold hum I'd felt on the craft, faint but unmistakable. I was still crouched there when I heard footsteps behind me. Slow, heavy, intentional. I spun around, hand on my sidearm, heart hammering, and found no one. Just the trees, standing too straight, too evenly spaced. I told myself it was stress, adrenaline, the kind of tricks your brain plays when the situation stops making sense. Then my phone buzzed. No signal bars, no service, just a single incoming message, time-stamped 3 minutes in the future. It read, "Leave the site." I didn't have time to process it before the sound came again, closer now, accompanied by a pressure in my ears like descending too fast in an aircraft. I turned back toward the clearing and froze. The object was no longer where I'd left it. It hadn't moved far, maybe 10 feet, but the dirt beneath it was still pristine. No drag marks, no disturbance. It was just elsewhere. That's when the helicopters arrived. 2 of them, black, unmarked, dropping out of the fog with surgical precision. They hovered low, wind ripping through the canopy, finally breaking the forest's unnatural silence. Men fast-roped down in dark uniforms with no insignia, faces hidden behind tinted visors. One of them approached me, raised a hand, and spoke my name before I could say a word. "Ranger Jackson," he said calmly, as if we were meeting for a routine inspection. "This site is no longer under park jurisdiction. You didn't see a plane, you didn't see an object, and you're going to walk back to your truck and forget exactly where this clearing is." Behind him, the white craft began to hum again, louder this time, and the trees around it leaned inward, like they were listening.
I told the man that whatever this was, it had come down in protected land, and that made it my responsibility. The words sounded hollow even as I said them. He didn't raise his voice or threaten me. He just looked at me through that dark visor, head tilted slightly, like he was assessing damage rather than resistance. "Zane," he said again, too familiar, "you've done your job. Anything beyond this point only makes things harder for everyone." 2 of the others fanned out, devices in their hands that didn't look like weapons but weren't cameras either. They swept them slowly across the clearing, over the craft, over the warped trees. Each time the devices passed near me, the hair on my arms stood up, and my teeth buzzed faintly like I'd brushed against a live wire. I asked who they were with. One of them laughed, short and humorless, and said, "That question always comes up." The hum from the object deepened, not louder but heavier, settling into my chest. I noticed then that the fog wasn't moving naturally anymore. It was pulling inward, thin tendrils sliding across the ground toward the craft, disappearing when they touched its surface. One of the men spoke into his shoulder mic and said, "It's stabilizing. We're late." That didn't sit right with me. Late implied a schedule. They escorted me out of the clearing without touching me, always close enough that I couldn't turn back. As we walked, the forest slowly began to wake up again. Birds called, insects buzzed. Sound returned in pieces, like a system rebooting. By the time we reached my truck, it almost felt normal, except for the helicopters still hovering low, and the way the men watched me like I was something fragile that might break if handled wrong. The man who'd spoken to me first handed me my radio. The screen lit up. Full battery, no record of the earlier pulse. "You'll file a report," he said. You'll describe a false alarm, weather interference, nothing found, and you won't come back here unless we ask you to. I asked what would happen if I did. He paused, just long enough to matter. Then we'd have to assume you weren't acting like yourself. They left without ceremony, no goodbye, no warning tape. The helicopters lifted, vanished into the fog, and the woods swallowed the clearing whole. I stood there for a long time, staring at the tree line where the object had been, trying to convince myself I hadn't imagined the vibration, the message, the way the forest had leaned towards something it didn't understand. Back at the station, I filed the report exactly as instructed. It was approved within minutes, too fast. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt that hum again, low and patient, like something waiting for a response. At 2:17 a.m., my phone buzzed on the nightstand. No number, no signal, just another message. Same location, 72 hours. I stared at it until the screen went dark, and that's when I realized the message hadn't been a warning, it had been a reminder.
I didn't tell anyone about the message. Not my supervisor, not the other rangers I'd shared backcountry shifts with for years. Experience teaches you when to speak up and when to keep your mouth shut, and something told me this fell squarely into the second category. Over the next 2 days, I worked my usual patrols, but the woods felt different now. Not hostile, expectant. Trails I'd walked 100 times seemed to bend subtly toward the Blackroot interior, like the land itself was pointing. 72 hours later, I returned to mile marker 17 before dawn. Officially, I was checking erosion after a storm that hadn't happened. Unofficially, I needed to know whether the message had been bluff, bait, or instruction. The fog was back, thicker than before, pooling low and refusing to lift. My radio worked, my phone worked. That somehow made it worse. The clearing was there, exactly as I remembered it, except the ground was no longer pristine. Pine needles lay disturbed, pressed into shallow concentric patterns around the center, like something had pulsed outward and the forest had settled back down afterward. The craft was gone. In its place was a circular depression, smooth and glassy, reflecting the gray sky above. When I stepped closer, my ears filled with that pressure again, and my thoughts began to lag, like my brain was wading through cold water. At the center of the depression lay something small, a metallic fragment no larger than my palm, shaped like a curved tile. When I picked it up, it warmed instantly, vibrating in a way that synced with my heartbeat. Images flashed behind my eyes. Not pictures exactly, impressions. Vast spaces, motion without sound, a sense of direction without destination. I dropped the fragment and staggered back, breathing hard. That's when I noticed the figures standing at the edge of the clearing. Not the men from before. These were taller, thinner, their outlines blurred by the fog. They didn't move. They didn't speak. They just stood there, watching, as if waiting for me to do something specific. I reached for my radio, but the pressure intensified, and my hand froze halfway there. The figures tilted their heads in unison. A familiar voice cut through the fog. "Easy, Zane. You're not supposed to interact directly." The visor man stepped into view, flanked by his team, weapons drawn now, aimed not at me, but at the figures. The air vibrated, the hum returning, deeper than before. The figures shimmered, their forms folding inward until they collapsed into nothing, like reflections wiped from glass. The man knelt and retrieved the fragment with gloved hands, sealing it in a case that immediately dulled its vibration. He looked at me for a long moment. "You weren't chosen by accident," he said, "but you weren't cleared either." I asked what that meant. He stood, signaling his team. "It means the forest likes you, and that makes you a variable." As they prepared to leave, he added one last thing. This wasn't a crash, it was a calibration.
and it's not finished. They disappeared into the fog, leaving me alone in the clearing once more. The forest slowly exhaled. Birds returned. Sound came in waves. I walked out before the silence could settle again, knowing with absolute certainty that whatever had come down wasn't measuring the land, it had been measuring us.
After that second encounter, things began to change in ways that were harder to dismiss. Not dramatic, not immediate, but subtle enough to gnaw at the edges of my certainty. My patrol routes started overlapping themselves, trails looping back where they shouldn't, landmarks appearing a few yards off from where they'd always been. I chalked it up to fatigue at first, the kind that creeps in after too many long seasons in the field. But the maps said otherwise. Distances were correct, bearings were true. It was the woods that were wrong. I requested archived aerial surveys from the last 20 years under the pretense of a research project. When I overlaid them, certain areas of Blackroot Preserve didn't line up. Not by much, a few feet here, a few degrees there, but the discrepancies formed a pattern, radiating outward from the clearing, as if the land itself had been gently nudged and never quite settled back into place. Animals started avoiding the area entirely. Game cameras within a mile of the site went dark, batteries draining overnight despite being new. One camera caught something before it died, a single frame of a deer frozen mid-step, head lifted, eyes unfocused, as if listening to something far above it. The timestamp read 0333 a.m., though the image was taken in full daylight. Then came the dreams. I'd stand in the clearing again, but the trees were gone, replaced by vast open space, the ground stretching endlessly in all directions. Above me hung the white shape, not resting, but hovering, its surface rippling gently like water disturbed by wind. I never saw inside it. I didn't need to. I always woke with the same certainty. It knew where I was, even when I was awake. The first official denial came 2 weeks later. A memo circulated stating that reports of unusual activity in Blackroot Preserve were the result of geological anomalies and atmospheric distortion. The wording was clean, careful, and completely wrong. Along with it came a directive restricting ranger access to certain sectors, including mine. When I pushed back, my supervisor avoided my eyes and told me off the record that my name had come up in a meeting I hadn't been invited to. That night, the hum returned. Not outside, inside my head. Low and steady, like a distant engine idling. My radio turned on by itself, cycling through channels until it stopped on one that didn't exist. A voice came through, distorted but familiar. "Zane Jackson," it said, slow and deliberate. "You are still within tolerance." I demanded answers. The response came not as words, but as understanding. The craft hadn't come to explore, it had come to align. Certain places, certain people. The forest wasn't reacting to it. The forest was part of the process. The next morning, I found boot prints outside my cabin. Not human, too precise, too evenly spaced. They led away from the road and straight into the trees, toward the restricted zone. I followed them farther than I should have, until the air thickened and the sound dropped away again. In the distance, the hum deepened, stronger than ever. Whatever had calibrated the forest was starting another pass, and this time it wasn't waiting for permission.
I should have turned back when the radio lost its signal again. I didn't. Years in this job had wired something into me that refused to let an anomaly go unexplained, especially one that wore my name like a calling card. The boot prints ended abruptly at the edge of a ravine I knew well, one that should have dropped steeply into shadow and deadfall. Instead, the ground sloped gently downward, smooth and pale, like stone polished by centuries of water that had never flowed there. At the bottom of the ravine stood the object, or what I first thought was the object. It was smaller now, compressed somehow, the same white surface folded into a tighter shape, hovering a few feet above the ground. It didn't hum so much as resonate, the vibration threading through my bones and setting my teeth on edge. The air around it bent subtly, like heat shimmer without the heat. Figures moved around it, not the tall, blurred shapes from before, and not the men in black uniforms either. These were human, mostly. Their movements were stiff, slightly delayed, as if their bodies were following instructions a fraction of a second after receiving them. I recognized one of them. It was a ranger from a neighboring district, a man I'd trained with years ago. His eyes were open, unfocused, his mouth slack. When he spoke, the words didn't quite match the movement of his lips. "We're helping maintain stability," he said. "You should leave, Zane." The visor man stepped into view beside the craft, as if he'd been there the entire time. "You weren't supposed to see this phase," he said, almost regretfully, "but containment is easier than erasure." I asked him what they were doing to the Rangers. He didn't answer directly. "The calibration requires anchors, familiar patterns, authority figures the environment already accepts." I felt the forest react around us, trees leaning inward again, soil tightening beneath my boots. The hum intensified, and with it came a sensation of being gently pulled apart, not physically but conceptually, like my memories were being sorted and weighed. Images flickered through my mind, my first day on the job, the faces of lost hikers I'd helped recover, the trails I'd memorized. The craft wasn't invading, it was referencing. One of the altered rangers stepped toward me, reaching out. His hand stopped inches from my chest, fingers trembling. For a brief moment, his eyes cleared. "It hurts to hold still," he whispered. Then his face went blank again, and he turned away. The visor man gave a sharp command, and the altered rangers retreated, positioning themselves evenly around the hovering craft. The ground beneath them brightened, lines forming in precise arcs that intersected at the center. I realized then that Blackroot Preserve wasn't just a landing site, it was a grid. "You still have a choice," he said. "Walk away, stay within tolerance, and this ends quietly for you. Or interfere, and the forest won't recognize you anymore." The hum spiked, the air thickened, and somewhere deep beneath us, something massive shifted, as if the land itself were adjusting its grip. I didn't know which choice terrified me more.
I stepped back, slowly, keeping my hands visible. Not because I trusted the man in the visor, but because the forest itself felt keyed to movement now, like sudden actions might trigger something irreversible. "If this is a grid," I said, choosing my words carefully, "then it can be disrupted." He studied me for a long moment. "That assumption is why your species keeps breaking its own habitats," he replied. "This isn't domination, it's correction." The altered rangers began to hum in unison, a soft vocalization that didn't sound painful but wasn't voluntary either. The lines on the ground pulsed, and the craft's surface rippled, briefly revealing depth where there shouldn't have been any. Not an interior, a passage, a sense of elsewhere pressing close. I felt a pull in my chest, not strong enough to move me, but strong enough to let me know it could. I did the only thing left to me. I used the forest. I keyed my emergency whistle, sharp and piercing, and blew 3 short bursts. The sound cut through the air like a blade. The trees reacted instantly, branches swaying violently, leaves shuddering as if startled awake. The grid lines flickered. For the first time, the hum stuttered. The visor man turned sharply.
That was unwise. Maybe, but it worked. The altered rangers staggered, their formation breaking as the forest's natural noise flooded back in. Birds erupted from the canopy, insects buzzed, wind tore through the ravine. The craft dipped slightly, its resonance struggling to reassert control. I ran, not blindly, but along a game trail I'd walked 100 times, one that twisted sharply and dropped elevation fast. Behind me, the sound changed. Not pursuit, adjustment, like a system recalculating. The ground shifted under my feet, the trail smoothing itself, trying to straighten, to bring me back into alignment. I veered off, crashing through brush, scraping my arms, following instinct instead of landmarks. Eventually, the pressure eased, the hum faded to a distant throb, and then vanished entirely. I didn't stop running until my lungs burned and the trees looked normal again, chaotic in their familiar way. When I finally slowed, I realized my radio was gone. So was my phone. My watch still worked, but the time was wrong, off by exactly 7 minutes. The fallout was immediate. I was placed on administrative leave pending evaluation. Officially, it was stress-related. Unofficially, I was told to stay away from Blackroot Preserve. The visor man never contacted me again, but I knew they were watching. Some nights, the hum returns, faint and distant, like a reminder I didn't finish what I started. The preserve reopened to the public 3 months later. New trails, new signage, subtle reroutes that no one questioned, but I see it. The way paths curve just a little too smoothly, the way certain clearings feel hollow, like something important is missing. I still walk the woods, just not as a ranger. And sometimes when the fog rolls in just right, I swear I see white shapes moving between the trees, not landing, not leaving, but adjusting, carefully, patiently, making sure the world stays within tolerance.
Life didn't snap back to normal after that. It thinned, like someone had taken a blade and shaved off the sharp edges of things I used to feel clearly. Sounds were flatter, colors less urgent. I passed the psych evaluation easily enough, answered the right questions, told them what they needed to hear. Stress, fatigue, overexposure to isolation. They signed the papers and let me go, confident the forest had done what it always did to old rangers, worn me down. But the woods didn't let go of me. I started noticing small inconsistencies far from Blackroot. Trail markers rotated a few degrees off north. Streams that flowed too straight for natural erosion. Wildlife behaving with unsettling coordination. Flocks of birds lifting simultaneously without any visible trigger. It wasn't everywhere, just certain nodes, scattered like breadcrumbs. A network. One afternoon, months later, I met a former colleague for coffee. He'd transferred shortly after the incident. While we talked, he paused mid-sentence, eyes unfocused, head tilting slightly, the same way I'd seen in the ravine, just for a second. When he came back, he laughed it off, said he'd been sleeping poorly. But his hand trembled when he lifted his cup. On his wrist, I saw faint, pale lines under the skin, geometric and precise. That night, I finally understood the warning. The calibration wasn't finished because it couldn't be. It required maintenance, human hands, familiar faces, people who knew how land was supposed to behave so it could be guided gently instead of forced. Rangers, surveyors, environmental planners, quiet professionals who worked far from cameras and crowds. The message came again, not through my phone this time, but through a letter slid under my door. No return address, no postage, just my name, printed cleanly. Inside was a map segment, hand-drawn, showing a region hundreds of miles away, a place I'd never worked, a place about to be adjusted. I burned the letter in my sink and watched the ash curl into shapes that made my chest tighten. I told myself I was done, that I'd already made my choice, but the forest had never accepted clean exits. It only changed the paths it offered. Last week, a small plane vanished over that same region. No distress call, no debris, just an empty gap on the radar. I heard it on the news, buried between weather and traffic. They used the same words they'd used before: atmospheric interference. I don't wear a badge anymore. I don't have jurisdiction, but I still know how to read land. And I know this: whatever came down in Blackroot didn't crash, didn't explore, didn't invade. It set a standard, and now, piece by piece, quietly and carefully, it's teaching the world how to meet it. When the fog rolls in these days, I don't look for shapes in the trees. I listen for silence, because silence isn't absence anymore. It's alignment. It looked natural if you weren't paying attention. I knelt where the body had been found and felt it immediately. Not the hum this time, something subtler, a sense of pressure without weight, like the space itself had been corrected and was proud of it. That's when I noticed the tree. Its growth rings were visible where the bark had split slightly, but they weren't concentric. They were offset, as if the tree had grown around a moving center. I pressed my palm to the trunk and felt a faint resistance, not physical, but directional, like pushing against a current. "You shouldn't be here." The voice came from behind me. Not the visor man, a woman this time, early 40s, dressed like a state geologist, clipboard tucked under her arm. Her eyes were sharp and tired, the kind you get when you know too much but not enough to stop it. "You're retired," she said, "and you've already been flagged." I asked her how many sites there were. She hesitated, then sighed. "More than we can staff, fewer than we need." She didn't deny it. That told me everything. She explained just enough to be dangerous. The calibrations weren't uniform. Some places resisted, some people did. Those outliers caused instability, disappearances, accidents. The system corrected for them, quietly. "We don't choose who gets involved," she said. "We just manage the aftermath." I asked her why I was still outside it. She looked at me carefully. "Because you listen," she said, "and because the forest hasn't let you go." Before she left, she gave me a warning, not a threat, a courtesy. "They're getting closer to urban areas, subtle first, infrastructure, green belts, places people don't question." That night, I stood on my porch and listened to the wind move through the trees behind my house. It sounded normal, too normal. I started keeping my own records after that. Nothing digital, no GPS tags, no timestamps that could be corrected. Just paper maps and handwritten notes, the way we used to do it before everything decided to remember for us. I marked sites where the land felt tight, where sound carried strangely, where people lingered without realizing why. The pattern that emerged wasn't random. It followed infrastructure. Old rail lines turned hiking trails, power corridors disguised as greenways, places already shaped by human intent. That's when it clicked. The calibration wasn't fighting us, it was using what we'd already built. I revisited Blackroot one last time, not entering the restricted zone, just skirting the edges like a ghost of my former self. The forest there felt settled now, almost relieved. Whatever tension had existed was gone, replaced by a smoothness that made my skin crawl. Trails flowed perfectly, drainage was immaculate, even decay seemed orderly. Nature optimized. Near dusk, I heard voices, a guided hike, families, kids laughing, a ranger explaining local ecology with practiced enthusiasm. He pointed out how healthy the forest looked, how resilient. I watched the group move on, noticed how they unconsciously stayed centered on the path, never drifting toward the trees. The land didn't need fences anymore. It had learned how to guide behavior gently. As I turned to leave, I felt it again. Not the hum, not pressure. Recognition, like the woods had noticed me and decided I was no longer relevant. That hurt more than I expected. For years, I'd believed I mattered to this place, that my presence meant something. Now I understood the truth. I'd been useful once. Now I was noise. The final confirmation came weeks later, buried in a zoning proposal I almost skipped reading, a controlled ecological realignment project slated for a suburban fringe outside a major city. The language was clinical, the footprint modest, the projected benefits impressive. I knew what it really was, another grid point, another quiet adjustment. I thought about warning someone, going public, writing it all down and letting the world decide. But I remembered the hiker against the tree, the rangers in the ravine, the way resistance didn't stop the process, it just created casualties. So I did the only thing left to me. I started teaching people how to notice. Not the craft, not the grid, the early signs. I volunteer now, leading nature walks, talking about how land feels when it's healthy, when it's stressed, when it's being managed too perfectly. I watch who listens, who feels it. Because the calibration doesn't erase wilderness, it refines it. And one day soon, the world will wake up in a place that works better than it ever has. And no one will remember agreeing to it.
The forest started talking to me in ways I couldn't ignore anymore. Not with voices, not with shapes, but in rhythm. Footfalls, rustling leaves, the way shadows bent along paths. Every subtle change was a message, a pulse, a reminder that the grid was still growing. I could trace it if I moved carefully enough, feel the lines in my bones instead of seeing them on a map. One night, I followed that instinct to a low ridge overlooking a valley outside the city. Streetlights flickered in alignment with the terrain, like tiny calibrations, not random, but deliberate. The fog hung low, brushing against the street signs, softening the angles, smoothing the seams. I realized then that it wasn't just wilderness being tuned. Urban spaces were now part of it too. Sidewalks, parks, even traffic patterns, they were being encouraged to bend subtly, to guide behavior, to keep everything within tolerances. I heard a vehicle approaching and froze.
A black SUV rolled down the service road I had used, unmarked, headlights dim. A single figure stepped out, visor man. No words this time. He raised his hand, just a gesture, and the vibrations I hadn't felt in months returned faintly, like the land acknowledging my presence. He didn't need to explain. I already understood. I was still part of the equation, even if reluctantly. I watched him walk away toward the valley, blending into the darkness, and as I turned to leave, I noticed movement along the ridge opposite mine. Small, precise figures, not quite human, not entirely unknown. They walked in formation, pausing at invisible nodes, checking lines in the ground that no one else could see. The forest hummed beneath my boots in recognition, approving, adjusting. I realized then that resistance was never the point. Observation was. Learning the rhythm, understanding the flow, sensing when the world had been adjusted, those were the tools of survival. The craft, the grids, the calibration, it was all a slow rewrite, a quiet, unstoppable ordering of everything. And humans who noticed, who could feel it without touching it, were the keepers of memory, the ones who remembered what came before alignment. I left the ridge as dawn broke. The city below glimmered, roads bending subtly, parks flowing naturally, the entire landscape humming with the satisfaction of perfect balance. I walked among it, invisible yet aware, knowing I'd witnessed a process no one else could see, a refinement no one could challenge, and that the world would never be the same. The calibration was patient, precise, eternal, and I was still listening.
Weeks passed, but the pull never left me. I walked the edges of forests, greenways, even abandoned rail lines, tracing the subtle alignments I could feel in my bones. Each time I sensed a node, a point where nature and human design overlapped unnaturally perfectly, I knew it had been touched, adjusted, calibrated. The craft wasn't just in Blackroot anymore, it was everywhere, quietly teaching the land how to behave, how to guide people, how to keep itself within tolerance. One evening, I hiked a trail in a state park I hadn't been to before. The sun dipped low and shadows stretched across the path. At first, everything seemed normal, but then I noticed the underbrush bending slightly toward the trail, guiding movement without force. Birds flew in tight formation above, avoiding certain clearings entirely. I felt the vibration again, faint, almost like a heartbeat. Then I saw him, a ranger from years ago, someone I knew would have resisted the pull of authority, now walking perfectly along the trail, eyes focused, expression blank. When he glanced up at me, his pupils seemed to flicker unnaturally. I knew immediately he had been calibrated, absorbed into the system without notice, his habits reshaped, subtly, irreversibly. I backed away slowly, keeping my distance, and saw the line of figures at the tree line, not quite human, not fully alien, moving silently, their presence folding the forest into itself. The trail beneath them smoothed slightly, as if even the dirt was being reminded to lie flat. I realized the calibration was no longer passive. It was teaching behavior now, how people should move, how they should interact, all without visible interference. A soft hum rose in the air, low and steady, threading through the trees, the underbrush, the rocks. It wasn't threatening. It was meticulous, purposeful, patient, and it was everywhere, like the pulse of the land itself. I touched a tree, and the vibration threaded into my palm. The forest recognized me, acknowledged my memory of what had been. I wasn't a part of the calibration, not yet. I was an observer, a witness. I left the park as night fell, knowing that every human step I had ever guided or corrected would be irrelevant in the face of the system now taking root. The world was being rewritten, quietly, one forest, one greenway, one node at a time, and no one alive would ever remember the chaos it had replaced.
I started noticing signs closer to my own town. Not dramatic, just subtle misalignments. A park bench perfectly centered under a tree, sidewalks curving gently to direct foot traffic, storm drains flowing in ways they never had before. I checked the blueprints. Nothing had changed. The forest, the land, even human structures were adjusting themselves, slowly, patiently, unseen. One night I drove past a suburban greenbelt and saw it, a small white shape hovering low between trees, almost invisible in the fog. My first instinct was disbelief. It was too far from Blackroot, too close to civilization. But the vibration in the air confirmed it. The calibration had expanded. It was mapping behavior, directing the world without interference, like a gardener pruning growth with invisible hands. I parked my truck and watched as figures moved along the paths. Not human exactly, but humanoid enough to recognize their purpose. They paused at intersections, adjusting benches, nudging fallen branches, tilting signs imperceptibly. Everything shifted, imperceptibly perfect. I could feel the land lean toward them. It wasn't violence, it was order, relentless and precise. A voice spoke behind me. I spun, hand on my sidearm, but it wasn't the visor man. A woman in a government-issued jacket, clipboard in hand, eyes calculating. "You shouldn't be here," she said. Her tone was neutral, almost clinical. "The calibration isn't designed for observation. It doesn't like distractions." I asked what would happen if I interfered. She didn't answer directly. Instead, she gestured toward the white shape. "Everything you see obeys a rule you don't understand. Step outside it, and the consequences are automatic." Her eyes flicked toward a cluster of figures adjusting a sidewalk nearby. One misstep, one glance off the path, and the vibration intensified, forcing compliance. I left before she could say more, knowing I had witnessed something no one alive would believe. I realized that the world as I knew it was being rewritten, not violently, not publicly, but with a precision so complete that no human system could detect it. And the craft, the grids, the unseen hands, they were patient, eternal. I tried to maintain a normal life, but the pool followed me everywhere. Even inside my apartment, I noticed patterns I couldn't explain. Furniture subtly shifted when I wasn't looking. Shadows in the corners of rooms aligned too precisely with light sources. On my balcony, the city streets below hummed faintly in rhythm with the vibration I had learned to feel in the forests. One evening, a news alert flashed across my phone. Another missing aircraft near a rural airport hundreds of miles from Blackroot. No debris, no witnesses, no distress signals. The report labeled it weather interference, the same phrase I'd seen years ago. But the coordinates lined up almost perfectly with one of the new nodes I had mapped on my own. The calibration wasn't just forests anymore. It was airspace, roads, human traffic, civilization itself. I returned to the greenbelt that night, hoping to see more, understand its behavior. The white shape hovered again, silent and low, vibrating subtly. I noticed the figures moving among the paths, not fully human, not fully alien, guiding everything, correcting every deviation. A fallen branch would right itself mid-air before touching the ground. A puddle of water drained in a perfect arc. Even the fog seemed to bend toward the node, dispersing or condensing like it had a will of its own. I thought about calling someone, a colleague, a friend, but the warning from years ago rang in my head. Interference wasn't tolerated. Observation was acceptable. I could watch, record, note, but touching, speaking, interacting, any deviation from the rhythm would have consequences, and I had already seen what those consequences looked like. I stayed on the edge of the node until dawn, feeling the subtle vibration thread through the earth beneath me. It pulsed like a heartbeat, quiet, controlled, infinitely patient. The city slowly woke, unaware. Cars followed curves with imperceptible obedience. People walked trails that guided them precisely, never straying. The world was aligning itself, and no one would notice until it was complete. When I finally left, I realized I had become a witness, not a hero, not a participant, just someone who remembered what had come before and what had been quietly rewritten. And the knowledge weighed on me heavier than any danger ever could.
By now, I had accepted that I was no longer a ranger. I was a witness, a map maker of absence. I kept moving between nodes, tracing the invisible grid as it expanded, following the hum and the subtle bends in the earth and air. Every location told the same story, nature folding into itself, infrastructure guiding behavior, people moving through spaces they didn't realize had been shaped. It was methodical, almost polite, but underneath that calmness, there was inevitability. One evening, I was at a riverside park on the outskirts of a small city. Streetlights reflected in the water in precise arcs, almost geometrically perfect. I noticed a jogger pause mid-stride, glance at a tree, then continue along a path she didn't even realize had been subtly curved to guide her. The vibration beneath my feet throbbed faintly, reinforcing the pattern, correcting deviation before it happened. From the tree line, I saw figures emerging, tall, slender, moving in synchrony. They adjusted branches, nudged benches, leveled a small mound of dirt with precise hand movements. I counted them, but their numbers seemed to fluctuate. They weren't human, not fully, and yet their movements were purposeful, careful, deliberate. A new layer of the calibration had begun, population interaction. I felt the pressure in my chest as I realized what this meant. Blackroot was the seed, the surrounding forests were next, suburban greenways followed. Now the city itself was becoming part of the grid. Every street, park, trail, building was being subtly rewritten to maintain alignment. And humans, as they moved through these spaces, were being guided without ever noticing. I wanted to warn someone, to stop it, to at least document what was happening, but the visor man's words echoed in my head. Step outside it, and the consequences are automatic. Observation was safe. Interference wasn't. I could see the pattern forming, feel it in the land beneath my boots, but I couldn't act. I was bound to watch. The hum rose, stronger than ever, threading through the city, the water, the trees. Even the river seemed to bend slightly, guiding flow, encouraging movement. The craft, wherever it hovered now, had become a silent conductor, orchestrating alignment with infinite patience, and I, alone, understood it all. The city slept, unaware of the adjustments, of the subtle forces shaping their paths, guiding their steps. I left the park before dawn, feeling the vibration fade beneath my feet, but knowing it was far from gone. It was eternal, precise, and patient. I started sleeping outdoors again, following nodes I'd already mapped, tracing the subtle bends in terrain, listening for vibrations that humans couldn't perceive. The world had become a network of invisible currents, guiding people and animals alike, and I was alone in knowing it existed. Roads, rivers, forests, city parks, they all carried the same pulse now, faint but insistent, like the heartbeat of a being far larger than anything human. One night, I set up near a suburban park on the edge of a growing city. Streetlights reflected off the pavement in nearly perfect symmetry. I noticed a child's ball rolling slightly off the path, and without knowing why, I felt a pull in my chest, almost like a warning. The ball rolled back along the exact path the system intended, stopping perfectly in line with a bench where a parent waited. I shivered. Even objects obeyed the calibration. Figures appeared at the edge of the tree line, not men in visors this time. Their bodies shimmered faintly in the lamplight, movements deliberate but fluid, almost like dancers adjusting the scene for an audience that couldn't see them. They bent benches, nudged branches, even shifted a patch of grass to maintain symmetry. Each movement was invisible to passers-by, but I could feel it, like the world itself was bending in real time. I considered approaching one, demanding answers, forcing interference. But the memory of the Blackroot ravine flashed back, the altered rangers, the pressure, the strict warning, step outside it, and the consequences are automatic. Observation only, witness only, interference wasn't an option. I found a spot near the tree line and crouched low, notebook in hand. Every line I drew, every notation I made seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the land. Even the fog carried subtle signals, weaving along streets, brushing branches, hinting at adjustments just beyond perception. The hum pulsed faintly in my chest, stronger when the figures moved. I began to understand the scale. Blackroot had been the seed, the small node where the system started. Over years it expanded, calibrating forests, parks, trails, infrastructure. Now it was moving into denser populations. Human behavior was being guided subtly. Roads, sidewalks, even patterns of movement were being corrected, and no one would notice, ever. As dawn approached, the figures melted back into the shadows, the vibrations faded, and the city awoke unaware. I packed my gear and left, heart heavy. I knew I would return, not as a ranger, not as a hero, not as an observer with hope of changing anything, but as a witness, forever tied to a system rewriting the world itself. I returned to Blackroot months later, not to enter the restricted zones, but to feel the pulse of the land, to see how far the calibration had extended. The forest was impossibly still, almost artificial. Trails curved subtly, drainage was precise, fallen leaves aligned along invisible lines. Birds moved in silent patterns overhead. Even the wind seemed aware, brushing along paths as if it knew the perfect way to guide my steps. I wasn't alone. Figures moved between the trees, faint outlines that shimmered when I tried to focus. They didn't hide, they didn't threaten. They simply adjusted, nudging branches, lifting rocks, straightening trunks, always imperceptibly, always perfectly. I watched for hours, feeling the vibration thread through my bones, matching the rhythm I had come to know as the grid. A new detail emerged. The humans who passed through weren't affected equally. Some wandered slightly off the paths, straying into misaligned areas, and the vibration intensified around them. I realized the calibration was testing, adjusting behavior in real time. Deviations weren't punished violently, they were corrected subtly. A misplaced step, a wandering glance, a misaligned thought, they were all guided back into tolerance. The realization hit me fully. This wasn't just a forest operation, it was a behavioral system, a network expanding across land and society. Roads, trails, cities, and infrastructure were nodes in the network, subtly influencing movement and actions. It didn't coerce, it didn't fight, it guided. And I, the witness, was becoming obsolete in the grand design. As night fell, the figures vanished into the fog, and I felt the hum fade to a faint thrum. I returned to my cabin and mapped what I had seen, connecting nodes across counties, states, and eventually entire regions. The network was vast, patient, relentless. Observation was safe. Interference was impossible without consequences. I was learning to exist within tolerance, as the forest and the system required. I realized then that the world was no longer mine to shape. It belonged to the calibration, and my role, watching, mapping, remembering, was all that remained.
The next months were a careful routine. I traveled quietly, mapping nodes, tracing invisible currents in forests, suburbs, and infrastructure corridors. Every site told the same story, the land bending subtly, the air thickening just enough to guide movement, objects shifting minutely without human awareness. I was no longer a ranger. I was a chronicler, a cartographer of absence, noting how the world was being rewritten. One evening, I was in a city park, hidden beneath a line of trees, watching commuters drift along curved sidewalks. The hum pulsed faintly beneath the pavement, guiding every step. A man jogged past, distracted by his phone, and the path beneath him shifted imperceptibly, nudging him back into alignment. He never noticed. Nobody noticed. The world moved perfectly, quietly, obediently. Then I saw them, figures in shadow, taller than humans, moving with deliberate precision among the benches, trees, and playground equipment. They didn't speak. They didn't interact with people directly. They adjusted. A branch here, a patch of grass there, the alignment of a puddle so subtle no human could perceive it. Every movement was careful, as if even the smallest mistake could ripple across the calibration. I noticed something new, a pair of agents observing from a distance, notebooks and cameras, faces neutral but calculating. They didn't approach, they didn't speak, just watched the network operate. Government oversight, it seemed, existed, but only as a record-keeping exercise. They didn't interfere. They were complicit observers, part of a system that no one outside it could fully understand. The hum intensified as night fell, threading through the city. Streetlights pulsed slightly, aligning to invisible grids. Water flowed through drains in perfect arcs. Even the fog obeyed, curling along sidewalks and park paths. I realized then that the calibration wasn't just environmental, it was social, behavioral. Humanity itself was being guided, step by step, without knowledge or consent. I stayed in the shadows, notebook open, recording every pattern, every subtle alignment, every human being quietly corrected. And I knew the process was infinite, unstoppable, and eternal.
I began noticing people reacting oddly to places I had already mapped. A woman paused mid-step on a sidewalk, glanced at a tree, then moved exactly along the path she was supposed to follow. A man, picking up his dropped bag, adjusted his grip subconsciously, perfectly aligned with the invisible grid. The system wasn't just guiding objects, it was guiding humans, molding behavior without confrontation or explanation. The realization hit me harder than ever. Deviation wasn't allowed, not because the system punished, but because it corrected. Subtlety was the method, obedience the result. Resistance created friction, not catastrophe, but it left traces. A few people I observed displayed strange micro-tremors, slight stuttering in movement, subtle discomfort, as if their bodies recognized the correction before their minds did. One night, I followed a small node into an industrial district. Factories, roads, and greenways intertwined,
all obeying imperceptible rules I could sense but no one else could see. Figures appeared among the buildings, adjusting angles, nudging debris, realigning objects. I noticed one of them pausing, studying me. I froze. The hum intensified in my chest, warning me. Observation was safe, but direct attention from the system was different. It spoke, not in words, but in understanding. I felt the weight of alignment pressing against my awareness. I knew then that I was being tested or cataloged. The calibration had expanded beyond land and structures. It had begun evaluating the observers themselves. My own movements, my attention, even my heartbeat were part of the grid now. By dawn, I was exhausted, drained, but alive. The figures disappeared. The city awoke, unaware, moving perfectly along the paths the calibration had set. I sat on a curb and watched, realizing the truth. The system wasn't malevolent. It didn't need to be. Its inevitability was horror enough. Civilization was quietly rewriting itself, shaping behavior, guiding thought, and no one, not governments, not humans, could stop it. I left the city as the sun rose, notebook in hand, trembling with the weight of witnessing a world permanently altered, unable to intervene, yet incapable of forgetting. The hum lingered faintly, a reminder that observation alone carried consequences, and I was not free of it, not ever.
I returned to the edge of Blackroot one last time, not as a ranger, not as a witness seeking answers, but as a man carrying the knowledge of a world being rewritten. The forest was calm, impossibly ordered, trails flowing like veins of a living organism, the hum beneath my feet faint but insistent. Everything was in place, perfectly aligned. Even the air seemed measured, balanced, patient. I watched from the tree line as figures moved among the trees. Not human, not alien, something in between, adjusting, correcting, guiding. They lifted rocks, straightened branches, nudged undergrowth into precise arcs, always with the same quiet, deliberate patience I had come to understand. I realized I had never seen them wrong, never seen a mistake. The calibration didn't err, it simply absorbed all deviation, folding it into order. I thought of the people I had observed over the past months, children, commuters, hikers, office workers. Every step they took had been guided, every action subtly corrected. No one knew, no one ever would. The process wasn't coercion, it didn't need to be. Compliance was built into the very environment, invisible, patient, eternal. A figure approached me, humanoid, taller than any human I had known, shimmering faintly in the filtered sunlight. I didn't flinch, I didn't speak. I just felt the hum thread into my chest, a pulse of recognition. It was not threatening, but it carried understanding. I had seen too much, but I was still allowed to leave. Observation was safe, interference was not. I walked away slowly, feeling the land guide me back along the path I had come, every step aligned, every branch, leaf, and stone subtly correcting themselves around me. When I reached the outer ridge, I looked back once. The forest, the grid, the invisible orchestration, it waited, eternal and patient, the world quietly rewritten without acknowledgement, without alarm. I understood finally that this wasn't a story anyone would hear, not governments, not agencies, not the public. I could document it, note it, map it, but humanity would never recognize it. The calibration would continue, extending into cities, forests, infrastructure, behavior, and I, Zane Jackson, veteran ranger turned chronicler, would carry the memory alone. The hum faded into the distance as I left the preserve. The world moved forward, unaware, aligned, obedient, and somewhere in the forests.